Hi, and welcome to another episode of Twice as Hard. I'm Janelle Benjamin, the founder and CEO of All Things Equitable. I'm very pleased to be here today with my next guest, LC De Shay. She is a reproductive healthcare analyst based in Berlin from Los Angeles. Welcome to the show, Leah.
Thanks, Janelle. I'm glad we're finally making this happen.
I am too. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while. And for those who don't know, you are a specialist in reproductive health and all things maternal newborn health. And your work really focuses on reducing health disparities, increasing equity for women in the workplace, but as well as in maternal health outcomes. Tell me a little bit about how you got into that work.
The short story of how I got into the work is that a professor in undergrad, you get to the age where you have to start doing the math, and you'd think I'd remember from like the last time I had this conversation, but I don't. 16 years ago, one of my professors sort of recognized that I stood out in class, and they had a colleague who sent out a blast requesting for a research assistant for a high-risk HIV, sexuality, and maternal child healthcare breastfeeding project. And this was being run by a couple doctors at Loma Linda University Medical School. And it was for South Africa and Lesotho, and whoever they had, some emergency befell them and they weren't able to go. And so it was like, we have, a ticket, we have accommodations. Are you willing to leave for 3 to 4 months? And I was like, yeah, definitely. At the time you're in your early 20s, it's like, I don't know, anything else better to do.
Yeah.
And prior to that, I had also gone abroad, like in the Caribbean and Central America, and been a part of some shorter projects. So like 6 to 8 weeks of being an intern with recovery centers for women who had been sex trafficked and or like who were at high risk for being sex trafficked, and trying to reduce outcomes of STI contraction or whatever else is going on. So I had various opportunities where people who were leaders in my arena when I was much younger mentored me and offered me space. And that was basically how I got into it, and really just took off from there. And I've been hungry in the sense that if it fit within my goals and it was available to me, I did it. It's like, not going to suggest that I was always super successful, but I certainly tried, like every opportunity that was presented to me. So that's awesome. My story.
So tell me about, I guess, the ways in which it's been twice as hard for you on your journey in this industry, where we don't see a lot of Black women. Although, on the patient side, we know, our experiences are also not always equitable. I've experienced anti-Black racism the only two times in my life I've gone to the hospital to deliver birth to both my children. I've had incidences that were not as kind as they should have been, sort of tarnishing my image of healthcare for Black women. Tell me a little bit about, I guess, how it's been difficult for you as a professional, and then what you may have witnessed. What makes it twice as hard for Black women in healthcare?
It's ever since we scheduled this, I've been thinking about this answer. And I think it's ironic that my podcast with Elizabeth just came out today. I'm glad I listened to it before we did this. So I feel like I'm like streamlining. And I don't want to be redundant, with people hearing me across different spaces. Honestly, I have to say the gaslighting is just, and I'm that specific term because the universality of like creating Clockwork Orange level situations for Black women, it seems unquenchable, on the part of people who seek to, if they can't get you out legally, then they're gonna get you out emotionally, like that's sort of how it feels. It's this very, very sadistic sort of hazing, but it doesn't have an endpoint because the end point is you no longer being present, whether it is as a patient or as a provider. If you aren't invisible, they want to force you into your own invisibility, basically make it so hard for you to be present and to be heard that you would just rather not exist in that space because they don't want you to be. And I think what makes it difficult, the twice as hard experience for me, is how much we are drowned in that element, where we're forced to survive something that is really mental torture at a certain level, both as providers ourselves and as patients. And providers are patients, this. I've been a patient, you've been a patient. Like, there is no, to me, as we were just discussing before we went on, like, I have never encountered a healthcare organization where there were complaints on the patient side, but they had some wonderful like equity outcomes in the workplace, or vice versa. You cannot do that because it is a culture. And if we're going to get into a biological, ecological standpoint, like, once you see one mushroom, that means the entire soil in that whole area has been it has been what's the word, to be colonized. It's funny
Yes.
that you use that word talking about fungus, but I think that's appropriate. Like, it's been colonized by the fungus that you do see. That means that there's an entire network that you don't see. And racism and the interplay between racism and sexism as it pertains to misogynoir is exactly the same. Whatever little nail they're trying to hit down, those are merely the most obvious points of an extraordinarily strong net that is holding up long-term inequitable outcomes, both for the workers and for the patients. So, and I'm preaching to the choir. Anybody who's been through this knows this, but I also feel like there's never going to be a point where we can say it enough until it no longer needs to be said.
Yeah. I love that you spoke about misogynoir, which is that unique intersection of being both Black and female. And you talk about that in a chapter of a book called Swing, that intersectional burden of parenting and the parent tax, right? Let's talk a little bit about that. Tell me about that book.
Not necessarily Swing. So Swing is the previous book that Ashley Renard already wrote. This is the follow-up. So she did sort of like a sequel, which was the sequel to Swing is, I believe, called Keeping It Hot. And I talk about how equity begins at home. Because a lot of so like on a personal level, I'm credentialed to do counseling, and when I was doing more patient care, I still do patient care, but it's only about 15%. It used to be the opposite, like 85%. And when I was doing postpartum coaching with my families, especially when it was, families who would want to identify as allies. So they're not necessarily the targets, but they're in a place of privilege and they want to translate that privilege into progress for other people, would ask, like, how as a parent do I ensure that my child doesn't inherit this? And I was like, but there isn't a neutral space. Like, decolonization starts at home. So like there isn't a space where you cannot be deconstructing your privilege. Like, you can't go home and be like, oh, I'm not privileged here. No, honey, you're privileged everywhere. And like, you have to, once you realize, it's going to show up in your personal relationships, it'll absolutely show up in your parenting, whether you mean for it to or not. But once you're conscious of this fact, so in that workbook is where I start talking about just like mother tax, not just mother tax at work, but also at home, which is this concept of, so we're talking about burnout. Unfortunately, the supposed progress, both in the workplace and at home, has not changed the statistical likelihood that women are still bearing the extraordinary burden of home care. Not just for the people in your home, but literally your home, everything about the home. Women are more likely to have to handle the calendar. They're still more likely to do far more of the chores. When men do the chores, women still have to be involved because they've put themselves in a place where it's like, where I'm going to do it, but you have to stage everything for me to do it. Like, you have to put the cleaner out, you have to hand me the broom, and you have to tell me how to do it, even though I'm 45 and I should have known how to do this for the last 20 years. Like, that's a tax.
You sound like you're speaking from experience.
Little bit. So
Yeah.
my husband is wonderful.
Mhm.
Ex-husband, he's ex-husband for a reason, right? And so like all of us have
Mhm.
situations where we can imagine this. And so, it's what's interesting, and I mentioned that in that book, the more intersectionality that has been thrust upon you in your identity is the more of a tax you deal with.
Right.
So as a white woman at work, your pay gap might be 15 to 20% with whatever other white man holds an equivalent position to you. And that is irritating, but it's not going to affect your life and your family and your financial livelihood in the same way it will for a dark-skinned Black or Indigenous or, Hispanic woman. I say that because our rates are close. Black women are still the worst off, but it's unfortunately within close range, all three of those identities. And so making 10 to 15% less is an entire galaxy away from making 58% less.
Right.
That's a whole entire other salary, right? And so that's going from, I have to go on like a smaller vacation than I want to I actually have to work an extra job in order to make ends meet, in spite of the fact that I already do more work than people in this position, they pay me less, right? So to have to deal with that and then come home into a household where, for various other reasons, we are also more likely to be responsible for significantly more financial burden, logistical burden. That is a level of burnout that it leads to weathering. That's where the concept of weathering comes from. So when employers are, and this just comes full circle, but you've had conversations with people in the past where you talk about introversion, and I consider myself an introvert, but the older I get and the more I look at the statistics, I'm wondering if with our generation, if introversion is not a means of coping with just like a constant level of rage. Like, how are you supposed to socialize and be jovial with people when you were consistently under the burden of things that other people won't take responsibility for, that you're being forced to, right?
Yeah, it's
so,
interesting. I'm finding a lot lately.
Yeah.
A lot of Black women are in fact introverts. And
Correct.
like you said, is it a coping mechanism? Do we become introverted because we've
trying to stay out of jail? Because if you keep bothering me for 30 minutes to have a conversation with you, I'm going to go postal. Like, please give me some space. Like, I'm joking, but I truly wonder. Like, it's a research study. It's research study fodder. But I wonder about it.
It is. Let's talk about that trope then, because you're making me think about that angry Black woman trope, right? That thing that gets put upon us when society is literally put upon us, and then, like you said, we go postal, and then we get labeled.
We don't go postal. Like, we don't. Can we be real? When was the last time you saw any Black woman going postal? It's remarkable. Truly, every day that goes by, I wonder, how have I not cussed someone out today? Like, based on the things that I've experienced.
Well, honestly, when I think about that idea that Black women go postal, and now I think about Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson and how
that's exactly what I mean.
That's what we do.
How she didn't go postal.
How she didn't go postal, and that is what we do on a regular basis. We maintain
every day
extreme composure in the face of horrible conditions and adversity and oppression and violence.
Mockery,
all of it.
The level of disrespect is just sky high.
Let's talk about it in the healthcare setting, because we know that the outcomes for Black women are completely different when they're having children, when they're just going for just any healthcare, right? If you're talking about stats for diabetes, for heart disease, for you name it, the outcomes and the disparities are apparent. Let's talk about a little bit about how it is we're sometimes in these settings where we're vulnerable. We're literally at the mercy of our healthcare providers, and we're having these experiences. Make that real for the viewers who are leaders in healthcare settings, but they don't understand what the experiences of Black women might be, and what we're talking about when we say there's anti-Black racism in the system.
Yeah. I have difficulty with this concept of making things real. Elizabeth and I talked about this off video, and I'm going to go a little bit more in depth in what we talked about. First of all, go listen to that podcast. And then secondly, I have extraordinary skepticism
Well,
with the idea
before you go on, the podcast that LC is referring to is Elizabeth Liba's Black Power Moves podcast on the Ebony Podcast Network. She will love that plug right there. So take a look at that podcast and you'll see a fantastic conversation between Elizabeth Liba and LC De Shay talking about all of these issues as well. Go ahead.
I want to, since we're talking about what leaders can do, I'm going to be a little bit more provocative. I truly believe that at this point, my colleagues, because they are my colleagues, administrative, executive managers, all of these people who are the most plugged in people in the world that you could possibly imagine. I've never met anyone more in tune or who has more access to technological knowledge, you know what I mean? Like virtual, just anything. Basically, you are in the forefront of access to technology. If at this point you have not been in contact with evidence of a disparity or heard or read or seen anything about anybody who's not white, their experience, is because you've tried very hard not to. The last 5 years have really been an explosion that has been unprecedented in representation across economic, so like socioeconomic status, across education levels. I don't know. I'm more interested in challenging why you, like, not you obviously, but like if there's someone listening that's like, but I've never heard about that. How and also why? Like, I'm gonna start there with you, because honestly, like, there's so many. At this point, what have you been doing to avoid hearing about it? If you were Canadian, if you were from the UK, if you were from the United States, that's my starting question. Like, I'm not gonna give you, oh, look at Serena Williams. How have you avoided it? She's been so vocal about it. It's not just that she's been vocal about it, she had to stop competing, you know, like Meghan Markle, like, you've gone so far, for God's sake, the first lady, the only first lady I feel like acknowledging. Joe Biden's cool, that's not nice. my first lady, Michelle Obama, you know, for all of the things, we can have a different conversation about political concerns and neoliberalism or whatever, but like, as a human being, Michelle Obama is like the Oprah of politics for most of us. And like, Oprah, literally all of them. There's an Ava DuVernay. No, none of them, all of them, to their credit, when they have been given the opportunity to ask anything or say anything about women's health who are Black, have brought this up. So why haven't you heard anything? That's my answer. And I feel like at this point, that's an appropriate response. You know, and anybody with the level of privilege who you're on LinkedIn and you're in the premier group, and so, you know, you're following me or they're following you, and you have YouTube unsubscribe, and how have you not, you know? And that's where I would start there. Like, what sort of life are you living that you can continue to be so insulated from even concepts of alternative experience to yours? And what are you doing to maintain that insulation? Let's start there, because otherwise nothing I show you is going to make a difference. You have something going on so subconscious and powerful that is influencing your behavior, that I can show you whatever I want. And if you haven't made yourself open or interested, it's not going to matter, you know?
Well, that is actually a thing, right? We know that there's lots of people who can't be swayed despite
confirmation bias,
evidence. Despite extreme evidence, right? It's presented to them, and then they're still with a what about reverse racism?
Well, here's an example. I don't know if you saw this. I'm sure you probably did, because again, how could you avoid it, especially for those of us who consider ourselves influencers, big or small? The remarks that the Mississippi governor made when he was asked about disparities. Did you see that? His remark was not that he hadn't seen it. It wasn't that he didn't know about it. In the most political terms that he could muster, he said, "I don't give a damn about this."
Oh, did he? I didn't see this.
He did.
Totally.
No, his remark was literally, and I quote, "Well, if you don't count the statistics for Black women and you remove those, then I think we're doing just fine."
Oh, let's just let's just take Black women out of the equation, and
Yeah,
let's look at the
because
data
let's
minus
just take
them.
Black women out in general. In other words, he doesn't care that they're all dying. As
Mm,
far as they're concerned, they shouldn't be included in the first place in anything, in care, in consideration about their performance for statistics. Like what he said in that statement was so intense. Like what he admitted to. So
mm,
when I hear people tell me, who I'm like, okay, what's your position, right? Like we're not talking about like no shade to janitors, but speaking realistically in terms of socioeconomic access, we're talking about levels of privilege that give you endless access to information, right? And
mhm,
all modes of information and media. If you were a manager at any level, if you're a charge nurse, you
mhm.
probably have the same iPhone I do, or perhaps a newer one. You know what I'm saying? Like you have a laptop in your house and you also have one in front of you on your desk. You have a car, you know? Like, what in the world do you mean you haven't heard about this?
Right. It's
So to
true.
me, it puts it in a different category where it's like, I'm going to challenge you on a more direct level.
Mhm.
Let's talk about why you haven't heard about this,
Let's
right?
talk about
And
why you, yeah, and why you haven't done anything about it if you have heard about it.
why haven't you sought it out? Why, do you get up every morning and decide,
Mm,
if I don't hear about it, it doesn't exist? And what sort of provider does that make you? Right?
mm,
Like you don't even have curiosity about other people's experiences, or are you so insulated in your own existence that you haven't even considered nor given a thought or compassion or interest of any sort to the fact that there are people different than you and that you
true.
should care about theirs? Like there's so many
Yeah.
angles you could take it from,
Yeah.
but to me they all get much closer to the root of the problem than pretending that me giving them a literary review list, first of all, that they're going to read it, and secondly, that they're going to care when they do.
I know,
So
I know. I had one asking me this morning on my page for a book list. It's like I literally
why don't you just take that sentence? When people do that, I take the sentence and I copy and paste it into Google, and then I click search, and then I take a screenshot of the search results, and then I give it to them as an answer. Here,
but the
since
funny thing
you're
is, in this case,
having a hard time.
I literally held up books on an episode of this show that they claim to have watched, and all the titles of the books were discussed
Are you
on
kidding?
the show. Yeah, and then there's
Okay, wait. So just to make sure that because I'm a disabled person, like, were they disabled? Are they not able to see well? Do they have like ADHD? They
I
didn't
don't
catch
know. They
it.
were like, what a great episode. Thanks for that lovely book conversation about all those books. Can you tell me like, give me a
Could you
book
tell
list?
me
It's
what
like,
the books were?
we literally just told you in the episode. Go back and listen. Anyway,
A little bit
yeah,
suspect.
too many people want you
Mildly.
to sort of feed them the information that is easily accessible.
Right.
Point taken. I want to end by us talking a little bit about solutions, right? To workplace problems, to maternal newborn health disparities for women and children. What would you say can be done to reduce disparities in health outcomes that are so different
I
for
always
us?
get asked this question, and I feel like I'm taking like the SATs every single time. So I'm like,
Apologies.
never
It's for the viewers. It's for the viewers.
Hmm. It's such a difficult, I feel like the further I get into my careers, the more difficult it is, because in the beginning you're like, oh, you just do this. Before you've had like more experience of dealing with people's contradictions and the whole extraordinary, just like black hole of possibilities that are trying to convince masses of people to behavioral change. I think the most important thing is that something has to happen in people's minds that gives them an emotional attachment to the group they have othered themselves from.
Mm-hmm.
Something has to happen. And in my experience, usually the things that cause that sort of perspective alteration are not clinical at all.
No.
They're oftentimes social or artistic or some combination of both.
Or they get a Black grandchild. All of a sudden they get a little half Black grandchild.
To me, as far as I'm concerned, that fits all three of the things I talked about. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it has to be on such a tangible, primal level for so many of these people. And it's like, well, technically it's unethical for me to put you in a situation that would elicit behavioral change, right? Like, not without your consent. But I honestly believe, and this is where I think intersectionality does not just apply to DEI or patient care outcomes or any of these things. Intersectionality, I think, should apply to the entire human experience, because most of the large changes in social priorities that we've seen have come through art. You know, Ava DuVernay's 13th, about the 13th Amendment in the United States, that shed light on just the extraordinary psychotic enslavement and exploitation that is happening in the prison system. And, you know, most of the things that I can think of where people's all of a sudden money appeared in grants, like to do research. And granted, most of us are like, you don't need research. You need this data list that I sent you that you didn't read, you know, whatever. But the point is, where interest and prioritization of a long-standing issue suddenly comes to the forefront of public concern, it almost always comes through art. It almost always comes through art in some way, shape, or form. And to me, journalism is also art. You know, writing is art. It doesn't just have to be like dancing and singing, although that helps. Visual performing arts is huge impact in our media. So the way that things are represented in the media, the way that they're represented in entertainment is enormously impactful, right? And that we could have a whole other conversation, and we need to at some point, about Black women and how they're represented in entertainment, right? Because that also, that perpetuates biases that people already have, you know, makes them stronger. So it sounds off base to most people, but I think that there needs to be a much stronger connection in the Afro and Indigenous art communities with scientists and with providers, because the only way for us to really get full circle into the collective psyche of human beings and break down these stratified, like automatic heuristic responses, is to get into a place in someone's mind that is novel, right? And that is memorable. And that is usually an experience people have through very abstract means. It's very rare that statistics are going to change the mind of someone who isn't interested in the first place, right? Like, you have to spark an interest. You have to create a situation where they start drawing equivalence between themselves and the other person, right? That they see themselves in community, basically, with that other human being. And the problem with racism and sexism and all of these other systemic prejudices is that colonialism, the entire force is to break down all levels of community. You know, the more separation, the more othering you can put between yourself and another person, is the easier and more natural it is to dehumanize them. And so from my standpoint, one of the ways that people learn to humanize each other again is through the least clinical, like least scientific means. It's either through socialization, although that has its hazards when we're dealing with racism, sexism, right? Because obviously the people who stand to suffer from that are us. And then art, which is an easier way for people to have very emotionally jarring or provocative concepts put in their forefront without them having the opportunity to cause further harm to the folks that they, you know, have not seen as part of their community. So it seems weird, but I honestly believe that that is one of the answers. And when I have participated in, like, when I do DEI for hospitals, I like to do a week. And my first couple days are almost all people doing snap reactions to and group, like their own group assessments of watching snippets of various art that tackle these issues. And when I tell you that the outcomes that I get are so significantly different than people who come in with a historical PowerPoint, and it has nothing to do with the validity. It has nothing to do, like, obviously what's in your PowerPoint from your medical history class is probably the most excellent information, but the only people who are going to respond to that are people who would have already looked it up themselves, because that's just how the human mind works. So you have to start in a way that people are amenable to. And that's
that
a
emotional
burden,
connection.
you know? Correct. That's a burden, which is also a whole other topic, because the burden of those of us who are not white, who are trying to teach that, is so much emotional labor. It's unspeakable, and there's re-traumatization that happens there, and
for sure,
you know,
for sure, I feel that all the time through this work. So tell me, what are the ways that you're currently combating that and working twice as hard? Because I know you're doing all the things, as we always are.
Hopefully not all the things. So
But how do you combat burnout? Let's start there, and then
how do I
tell me,
combat burnout?
yeah, and what you're currently working on.
I mean, boundaries are a big deal. I am
Yeah.
not suggesting I'm good at enforcing them all the time. I'm just suggesting that I understand they're necessary for me to stay sane. So like, and if you're a parent and I'm a parent, and so I think boundaries are even more, there's such conflict as a parent, as a femme parent, just trying to draw boundaries, but also meeting the needs of your children. And I feel like that's a whole other, I would love to do like an FAQ about that. Because I feel like that's a discussion that most of us need to hear. But
well,
with
do
those
it now.
things said,
Tell people what is a femme parent for those who don't know. What does that mean?
So I'm genderqueer, so I qualify. I'm genderqueer. I do not experience well, I won't say that. I very rarely experience dysphoria. Dysphoria is when it feels like parts of your physical and mental experience are discordant on an identity level. So mentally you feel one way and you feel like your body is in direct conflict with that. And that is something that characterizes a trans experience. So I don't identify as trans, mostly because I hold it very sacred. The beginning of my career with HIV research 15 years ago was working with a huge trans community. And I just feel like that is it is a beautiful life, and it is thrust into some of the most monstrous circumstances because of how society treats them. So there are people who are genderqueer who consider themselves on the trans spectrum for the sake of respecting what folks who live as trans go through. I do not. I separate my identity from that. But femme is anybody, regardless of their sex. So meaning assigned sex at birth, like regardless of what their genitals are, anything, who identifies with femininity or femaleness. I say that because one is sex, as in your, body parts, and the other one is gender, as in your social identity. So however that person wants to define it, wherever they find themselves in the spectrum, that's femme. But it's used to signify that they are queer. Like that's not something that cis people say about themselves usually, right? Like if you're cis, you'll just say girl or woman or whatever else is going on. So those of us who are queer, if we decide that's where we skew on the spectrum, then many of us will use that, but I use that interchangeably with other things that are not gendered. So,
okay. And so what does it mean to be a femme parent? And how do you feel like that's different?
It's different because I just, it really alters, you know what, I'm going to say it alters everything about your children and your experience. There's so many unspoken and really, for me, they're suffocating, but unspoken and very strong, specific expectations about what it means to be a mother. In your attitude and your behavior, in what you are supposed to be responsible for. And like, for me, I am not the person who the school calls. And they've called me and I've been like, no, call my husband, I'm busy. Which is like, so like for some, and a lot of people will hear that and like, whoa, like you're like, something about that bothers you. Like, that's the gender roles.
That's the, yeah.
Right?
No, true.
And it sounds like it's so subtle, but it's not, because people's responses aren't subtle when you don't meet the expectations, right? Of what it means to be a mother.
It's true. I'm thinking about that in my own life. My son does that to me quite a bit. You're a mom, you're supposed to do this. Mom, you're supposed to do that. It's like,
right.
Who
so, but according to who?
That's what a mom's supposed to do that. Who told you that? Yeah.
Right. And so like, it's, even in public. And to me, when it starts to become subversive in a good way, like where it makes people think and like they're uncomfortable, maybe they don't want to say it. Sometimes they do.
Yeah.
For instance, if we're out somewhere, like I have been out with friends, and not recently, unfortunately, but like pre-pandemic, we would be at a friend's house or whatever, and I would be sitting there eating, and my kids would want something, and I was like, did you walk past your father to ask me this question? Because that's me prompting my children to be like, go ask your dad.
Yeah.
Like, not just for this thing, just in general.
No,
Like,
no,
what I really want them to think about, like, why would you walk past that parent to ask me
yes.
something?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
While I am eating, I also have a right to eat. And like,
Yes.
I tell my children that, not in a mean way, but it,
Yeah.
why does it have
But
to
no,
be
it
mean? It's
causes
my
them
kids have
to
a right
think.
to eat.
No, but
Right.
it's absolutely important to challenge our
Yes.
children and have them to think critically about the choices and
Correct.
decisions they're making around gender, because the world is conditioning them to be sexist.
Yes.
Right? It's conditioning them to be sexist, to be, homophobic, heterosexist,
Yes.
all those things.
All those things, yeah.
And so we have to deconstruct it in whatever ways that we can, right? I'm a very strong proponent, my cousin laughs at me. I bought my son a book when he was, I think, 2 or 3 years old, and it's called F is for Feminism, and it's an alphabet from A to Z, right?
Yeah.
I didn't have a daughter at
We
the
have
time,
that
and
book.
it's like, you will be
Yeah, I know that
feminist.
book.
I'm not doing a very good job at making him feminist, but
you can't make your children do anything. If there's
I
one
know,
thing you learn while you're raising them
the
is that
thing.
so you can just give him the information. It's like what we were just talking about with behavioral change.
Yes, I give him the information,
That's
and
right.
then
That's all you can do.
I allow him to make his own choices, and then I'm sorely disappointed, like when he
and then you look down on those choices like any good Black mother.
Yeah.
Make
like
it
when
clear
he decided that he didn't have a mask to go into school one day, and I looked down in the car and his sister's mask was there, and I'm like, perfect, a kid's mask, it fits right.
Right.
She's 5 years younger, but it's a mask that works, but it was pink. Okay. I handed it to him and I said, here, wear your sister's mask. And he goes into this, he grabs it, he's like, great. He starts to walk into the school and he starts to put it on. And I'm like, okay, good. He's putting on his sister's mask and he's going to be safe and protected. By the time he turns around at the school door and waves at me, the mask is flipped on the back side, and the either white or the black was showing. So not the pink side. He put the mask, and I said, oh, geez, he's already internalized. I think he was 7 at the time, or 8, that he should not be wearing pink. And I'm like, oh no, what am I doing? I'm failing as a mom. But we talked about it when he got home. It's like,
but you're not, you can't, you're only one person.
Exactly.
Right. You're only one person. And I always remind parents when I'm doing parent coaching, like about the research that shows that peers have like 6 times the impact. Which, like, on the one hand, it should give you a sigh of relief, and on the other hand, it's going to give you a stroke, right? Because, like, what are you supposed to do about that?
Totally. His peers are all into Roblox, and I don't even know what else. It's frightening. So thank you for talking to us about, your identity, what it means to be a parent with intersectional identities. All of those things are really important. And let's talk about the ways that you're currently working twice as hard. How does that show up for you in your work? And what do you have on the go?
So I work with a lot of NDAs, and I can't always be terribly explicit about what I'm doing.
Okay.
Non-disclosure agreements for folks who don't know. I know you know, in case anyone else watching doesn't. So to be general, right now I am working on the launch of a parenting tech app.
That's exciting.
And digital space and community is extremely exciting. I was called into this project before the beginning of the pandemic, actually. So it's been really lovely to watch this. It's a family of color, femme owned company. And like not white passing of color, like actually of color. She's not Black, but definitely is not white. And I really enjoy, I've loved working with them. In terms of working twice as hard, I do that less in this position than I've done in other positions, which is an enormous relief. It's an enormous relief. I think my biggest challenge right now is what you and I were just talking about before, is I'm really starting to realize what a burden it is. The insecurity of being a consultant is starting to wear on me. And so the working twice as hard is more coming in with the constant anxiety that is sort of wrapped up in making your money that way. And you know, in some level, like, okay, being a full-time employee is also not like you could also wake up and be let go tomorrow. So in some ways it's not exactly that different, but you know, not having benefits and all of these other things. And as Black women, we are significantly more likely to find ourselves in those circumstances.
Yes.
So my working twice as hard is having to be the best of the best of the best of all of the consultants, which I'm sure every Black woman who's out there knows exactly what I'm talking about. And on some level, it's ridiculous. Like, I already know I'm the best. I'm not being cocky. I'm just being tired, right? Like,
I love it. No, you are, I mean, in what you do in your niche area, you absolutely are, and you should own it and say it with conviction. Don't even laugh about it when you say it.
I'm laughing instead of screaming, not because I think it's funny, but you know what I'm talking about. Where you're like, ah.
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. No, like I know I'm the best, you know, but it's like I wish I could be. I just want more security. And part of racism and sexism is never letting you rest. Like, okay, you're the best now, but we're gonna make you like scritch and scratch for every single crumb, even though we know nobody does this better than you do. Because part of the dehumanization is like, you don't deserve a certain level of comfort or security or whatever. So no matter how good you are, you're always gonna have to wonder at night if you're good enough. And I just
and is the banner year you're having this year going to be the banner year next year? Like, you know, should I be hoarding my resources and
that's right,
saving for a rainy day? Yeah, you're right.
It creates a scarcity complex that is so, I feel like on an epigenetic level, it's just in complete conflict with the way that we want to exist as Black women. So you know, Black culture is at its heart one of the most generous cultures, and I really don't know any other culture that I've interacted with where the mindset is of collectivity and generosity and communal care, and like besides in folks who are indigenous, you know, for some of us we're both. And I was just talking to a friend today, like all of my help that I've gotten in the past that has come truly without strings have only been from Black people. I have never experienced outside of our culture, you know, like, I don't know about how you grew up, but like, for instance, when I was young, and like my aunts and uncles would just be in church and you give you like that special handshake where they like put money in your hand. And like, you're not allowed to say anything about it. They didn't even want you to say thank you because it's like, don't draw attention. Like you deserve it, you know?
Exactly. I understand.
And at our hearts, when you get us away from this horrific, like violent striving to just exist, when we're among ourselves and there's a measure or expectation of safety, we are just the most generous people. And it's like, what can I do to help you? And like, don't have pride. Like, tell me, okay, maybe you don't want to tell me in front of everybody. And then once you get the help, people will literally be like, don't mention it. And they're serious. Do not mention it. Like, it's done. I already gave it to you. Like, this is a blessing. God gave it to me to give it to you. And this is how we behave. And there's something about being thrust into this capitalist like hellscape of just manufactured competition that I feel like is at odds, like on a soul level, with the way that we desire to thrive. And being a consultant, I'm realizing, even though I love the companies and I love my work and I get paid well when I get paid, you know, like all of those things, that still knowing that all of that is contingent upon people who don't look like me deciding that I'm good enough, it's still some type of anxiety, you know? Yeah. And so I'm starting to weigh that.
Well, you've demonstrated through this conversation that you are definitely the best of the best. If people need to reach out to you, how do they find you? I know that
LinkedIn is the best place to find me. It has all of my information there. I check every day, like my inbox and stuff. And if people want to meet with me, I mean, you know this, we met within like, I don't know, a couple weeks of when we talked. So if it's someone who is like-minded, we have similar goals, or if you have a suggestion, like something you want to work on, I'm always willing to at least be like, you know, tell me what you want to do. Like, that's something I'll always indulge. So that's the best place to meet me. I have limited though my requests to there, because as a form of boundaries, I found when I start giving out my email that people I had never would have given it to start getting it.
I understand.
So
I understand. Totally understand. So reach out to LC De Shay on LinkedIn. I'm
Yes.
Janelle Benjamin on LinkedIn, allthingsequitable.ca, everywhere else. Click like down below, subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing. And comment if you enjoyed today's conversation. And we'll see you next time for another episode. Thank you for being a guest.
Thank you so much,
I really
Janelle. I
appreciate you.
enjoyed it.
I did too.